Bruce Solheim draws on his own experience to describe the paranormal experiences of children. Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the paranormal experiences of children. My guest is Dr. Bruce Solheim, who is professor of history at Citrus College in Glendora, California, where he teaches a course on personal paranormal history through their continuing education program. Dr. Solheim is the author of 6 books dealing with political science and history, and he has written 2 books about his own personal paranormal experiences. They are called Timeless and Timeless Deja Vu. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you for having me, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. One of the things that you pointed out to me with regard to the courses you teach on personal paranormal history is that you find students are eager to enroll because it gives them a safe space to discuss their own personal experiences.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I've found. It was actually my wife, Ginger, who said, now you're probably going to find that people are going to want to do that. So I was so busy preparing the course, I didn't really think what was going to be their main motivation. And that is it. Mm-hmm. And they're young and old, and they've all had experiences, and they want someone safe. And I even had 2 colleagues. I had one of the librarians and a math professor who took the class. And they were funny. The math professor, when he was talking to other colleagues and myself, he'd kind of look around and see if anybody's looking, and then he would tell me his experience. And I've had other people do that too, even people who haven't taken the class. They've heard about it, staff members and stuff, and they want to ask me questions. So that's what it is. It's a safe space for people to discuss their experiences.
You grew up in a family where your mother encouraged you to begin to at least acknowledge the kind of psychic experiences that I presume are normal for most children.
Yes, she did. Both my parents were from northern Norway, and my mother was very psychic. She wasn't like a practicing psychic, but she did encourage it. My father was rather practical and didn't encourage it at all. In fact, when my mother and I, when I was little, being very little, I remember having playing cards, and we'd read each other's minds, and we'd get a pretty good hit rate. And we'd do it until my father said, that's enough. Okay, that's foolish. Don't do that. And he did it after we hit a couple in a row. And then he'd say, okay, that's it. I think it scared him a little bit. And he was so practical. And she was an artist. So that's what, she was very open to it. And all my experiences, I could talk to my mom. I wouldn't necessarily talk to my dad about these things.
Now, you mentioned your parents grew up in a very isolated part of northern Norway.
Yeah. On an island 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, called Andøya, which means Duck Island, although there's no ducks on the island, so maybe they ate them all. I don't know. But it's very isolated. When I first went to Norway, I was 4 years old, lived at my grandmother's house, which still exists. My brother and my 2 nephews, and I have the house still, about 200 acres farm that's not farmed anymore, but So that was the first time I went there, and there was no way to get to the island except by ferry boat or by air, or that was it. Mm-hmm. Now they have a bridge to the island, and there's no hospital on the island, so it is very isolated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about it earlier, you described to me how in this context, an isolated island 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, people who lived there took psychic experiences for granted.
It was very normal. It was very normal for people. So really the paranormal is more normal than people think. And, the experiences that I had there with my parents and also my relatives and cousins, I'm related to so many people on that island. It's not surprising to them when you talk about, oh, I saw a ghost or, this or, any type of paranormal stuff. Mm-hmm. The belief in, some people would call it superstition, others maybe not. Troll stories, all that stuff. You grow up with all that stuff. And it all seems very natural. And I didn't think it was strange. So, reading my mother's mind with cards, none of that seemed unusual or strange. It just seemed very normal. I'm under
the impression your father, who didn't really encourage any of this, wasn't necessarily a disbeliever.
No, I don't think so, but he was a great storyteller. Mm-hmm. So I think the psychic part of me is from my mother. The storyteller part is from my father. He was a sailor. He left home at age 13. He left home. He worked on a fishing boat, and then he joined the Merchant Marines when he was old enough to do that, then the Norwegian Navy. So he was a sailing man. And I remember sitting around in the living room, and we had a globe on our table, and which is great. I think all homes should have a globe. It's just for kids. It's so important. I remember looking at that and spinning it around, and I'd put my finger on a spot on the globe, and I'd say, "Have you been there, Dad?" And he said, "Yeah, I've been there." And he told me a story about, Morocco or Antarctica. He'd been to Antarctica. He'd been to Karachi. He'd been everywhere around the world. So, it was. So I grew up with that kind of acceptance of the paranormal and also the storytelling tradition. So yeah, he did offer that part. He was very practical otherwise, but he could tell a story.
And in your course on personal paranormal history, I presume one of the things you're trying to do is to get your students to understand that when they have these experiences, there's some meaning to be found, that there's a story there.
Yes. And when we start the class off by kind of defining some of the paranormal terms. What is telepathy? What is telekinesis? What is mediumship? All this type of stuff. And so they can get a baseline, because a lot of them they've had experiences, but they don't know what it's called. They don't know what's going on or what the theories are behind it. So we do that. And then, when they share their stories at the beginning, kind of their life story, which sometimes I have to cut them off and say, okay, we got to go to the next person, because they just say one thing after another. I do have to, I give them a framework for understanding what these things, because a lot of them don't know why these things are happening or what it's called, or even that other people have had similar experiences, and they find out, oh, I'm just like this other person. And so that it's very personal. So the idea that it's personal, a paranormal personal history class is the essence of it. And that's really how I teach history too, that all history is very personal.
And now you've written 2 books on your own personal paranormal history with dozens of experiences.
Yeah, the first book, Timeless, had 34 experiences. Timeless Deja Vu had 31 experiences. And the third book, it's a trilogy, will come out next year, hopefully, called Timeless Trinity. And it will have probably another 32 experiences. So I held some back. The first book, I wanted to test the waters, because I'm an academic, and I wanted to see what would happen. So some of the more bizarre stories I kind of held back. And it's not that I toned it down, but I just kind of saved those in reserve just to see what would happen. And it was well received by my colleagues, by the college, by readers. So I figured, okay, I'll venture a little bit further with the second one. And then with the third one, it's going to be probably the most spiritual of all of them. I'm kind of putting it together in a larger sense. And so it'll go even further. I'm sticking my neck out even further with the third one. But I would say that the most important thing about it is that I want people, with the first book, the theme behind it was, I don't want people to be so afraid of dying that they're not going to live their lives. And that's kind of if you could pick a theme, that would be one of them. Mm-hmm. And with the second one, it's to not be afraid to learn more about what's going on, and to also know that there's a darker side to this stuff too. So kind of a warning. With the third one, I think it's going to be a more holistic kind of bringing everything together. I haven't totally formulated yet because the stories are still coming out, and then things keep happening to me. Mm-hmm. So when I was younger, and it's like I had a big radar dish over my head, and things just happened. Some people have called me a paranormal lightning rod. So that's kind of what it was. But I had I don't want to say the word control, but management. I had no management of it. Mm-hmm. Now I've learned to manage it so I can sleep better at night and stuff like that.
Well, I would imagine when it comes to young people, children, that maybe 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, I don't know, is going to be very gifted in terms of their parapsychological capacities, and they will be like a lightning rod. They'll have many experiences, and as you've learned from your own students, there aren't often safe places where people can discuss these things.
That's true. You can be ostracized, and then, the first thing that happens when you go to school is that, they tell you, well, your imaginary playmates, they're not real. So you have these real kids in the classroom. So let's not talk about that. And so they challenge that at first, and then you learn to adapt. Kids are pretty adaptable, and they'll say, okay, I won't talk about my 2 imaginary playmates. In my case, it was John and Johnny. I had 2. One was older and one was younger, which is kind of a whole weird dynamic. But, so.
Did you see them visually in your mind? They were like, I would call them apparitions?
Somewhere between, and I've seen actual physical manifestation, a ghost and an apparition before. I would say they're somewhere between, a dream state and an actual awake physical apparition.
Almost like a hypnagogic state.
Yes.
Which children can probably easily go into.
Slip in and out so easy. And it was so natural to me. And my brother was 9 years older. My sister was 15 years older. So she wasn't even living in the house. Mm-hmm. My brother didn't want to really play with me. So oftentimes I was playing at home by myself. So, these 2 playmates were pretty nice to have, pretty convenient, and they did what I wanted to do. And I was always a little bit of an unusual kid in that I remember as a 6-year-old, I wanted to ride my bike to the graveyard. And I would get my little friends to go with me sometimes, but other times they were spooked out by it. And
you mean your real friends?
My real friends, yeah. My imaginary friend I could take anytime. Uh-huh. But so we'd pack a lunch, and we'd go have lunch at the graveyard, which I thought is pretty unusual, although I thought it was fine. Mm-hmm. And after a while, they just started we had one experience there at a lake that was behind kind of the mausoleum.
Now, and we're talking about not Norway here.
No, this is in Seattle.
You grew up in
Kenmore, which is the north end of Seattle, north end of Lake Washington, that area.
So you're basically an American.
Yes. I was born in America. My brother and I were born in Seattle. My sister and my eldest brother, who died during World War II, were born in Norway, and then my parents are born in Norway. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So, and now it's just me and my brother. Parents are gone. My sister's gone.
Yeah.
And like I said, my eldest brother died during World War II, so he would be in his 70s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, at this point.
You're there at the graveyard with your friends.
Yes, and we're having lunch. And I remember there was this very large statue of Jesus kind of in the center of the graveyard. And I remember that it was kind of a sad-faced Jesus. There's different motifs, with this. And I remember having a discussion with my friend. I wrote about it. He said, well, I don't know if Jesus would, because he was Catholic. And I was Lutheran, that's typical of Norwegians, to be growing up as Lutherans. And, so he said, I don't know if Jesus would like us to be here, here in this graveyard. Are we being disrespectful? And I said, no, all these people here like us to be here. They want us to be visiting. So it's like I felt like I wanted to be there, and I knew that I was welcome there. Mm-hmm. So I said, I think that's what Jesus would want too. So he agreed with that for a while until we had this spooky experience at the lake, and then that was it for him. So
what happened?
Well, it was I would classify it as kind of a cryptid experience. So there's this, we called it the swamp pond, not really a proper lake because there was too many lily pads. It was a little too green for swimming. And it was below the mausoleum, so you had to go through the woods on this dirt path on our bikes and go down by the swamp pond. Well, we were down there and it was getting kind of late in the day, and it's kind of a dark area anyway with a lot of big trees and vines and lily pads. So it's a little spooky anyway. We started hearing something on the other side of the lake crashing around in the sticker bushes and in the, just like a sound of something big over there. Mm-hmm. And I was really interested, and my friend said, let's get out of here. And I said, okay, well, yeah, we'll get out. And it kept coming around the lake. We didn't see it, but we heard it coming closer. So I said, okay, I think it's a good time to leave. And he took off really fast up on the dirt path, and I started off, my chain fell off. So I was a little nervous, trying to get the chain back on. Those old bikes we had, the chain was always coming off. And I finally got back on it, and by the time we got up to the top, I looked around, and there was a shadowy figure by these, I don't know if you'd call them crypts or whatever, these concrete things I think they put in the graves. There's like a stack of them there with sticker bushes around them, and some teenagers had spray painted some stuff on them. And there was a dark figure there kind of on its hind legs, and it was, I couldn't really quite make it out what it was because it was kind of dark. It looked like some kind of it could have been a very large dog, like a wolfhound, but it was on its back legs, or who knows what it was, but it terrified us so much. I never went back to the lake, and my friends never went back I still went to by myself to the graveyard, but they wouldn't go to even to the graveyard. But we never went back to the swamp pond.
So you were frightened.
It did frighten me, yeah, because I think part of it was how frightened my friend was too. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't frightened in the graveyard, but I was, because I kept going back there. But whatever this creature was, or large animal, or whatever the thing was, if it was a dog, it was a giant wolfhound, which are not too common. Mm-hmm.
But the fear of ghosts, the fear of the boogeyman, is part of a child's experience.
Yes. And so, I think I was more accepting. I wasn't as fearful as my friends, although I had a feeling that, some of them just said, well, these things aren't real. They were trying to convince themselves. I knew they were real, but I also knew, based on what my mom had told me, that it probably wasn't going to hurt you. And I think I was more accepting of it. And I was more accepting of the fact, because I was familiar with, the graveyard and not afraid being there. I think that maybe helped me accept the ghost stories. And of course, my dad told stories. Sometimes they were ghost stories from fishing and stuff. Mm-hmm. So, but the way he looked at it, it was just more of a tall tale, where my mom, she knew it was real. And so did I.
Let's go back to your imaginary friends. You use the term imaginary, which suggests that they're really, these are some kind of fantasy that you concocted.
Yeah, I have a feel. Well, I use that term because that's probably what most people would say. Mm-hmm. I would say that there was some entity to it. Mm-hmm. Johnny, there was John and Johnny. Johnny, it's kind of funny. I did both have variations of John, but John was a kid my age. And, so he was just a regular kid, but he was, I guess people would call him imaginary. I just called him my playmate. Mm-hmm. And, Johnny was different. Johnny was, that's Johnny. John, was older. Mm-hmm. And he didn't really play with us, but he kind of hung around with us. And he wasn't threatening, but he wasn't friendly either. He was kind of a protector in a way. I kind of thought of him as kind of like somebody who would watch kids that are playing, babysitting or whatever. So that was John. Later, I came to call him Big Bad John. But he really wasn't bad. He just had kind of that kind of disposition.
And I think there was a popular song from those years.
Yeah, Big Bad John. And really, Big Bad John wasn't bad. He gave his life to save all the miners out of the mine. So, it's kind of interesting that's who he was. But, I saw them. Other people didn't see them.
Yeah. Well, William James has suggested that when it comes to spirits, that you've got what he called two wills. Is you have a desire, you want to have some playmates,
right?
And of course, young children have an imagination. You can imagine playmates, but there might also be an autonomous spiritual entity that steps in and kind of cooperates with the imagination, the imaginal image that you have created. You may know the philosopher Henri Corbin uses that word imaginal to distinguish it from imaginary, to suggest it has a little bit more, maybe a lot more ontological status.
Right. And I think it is kind of a meet halfway kind of a thing, which, when I do mediumship, that's what I'm doing. You're raising my level of vibration or whatever people want to call it. I have to meet the spirits halfway. You can't just stay like we are right at this moment. You have to get to a higher point. And I think kids can do that very easily without knowing what they're doing. And based on the need of a playmate and maybe the need for a protector to watch over us so we don't have to worry while we're playing. So that's kind of interesting. I use the term imaginary, but to me they weren't imaginary. So they're very real.
But at some point, did you outgrow them? What?
I think school, the more I was at school and as we grew up and friends who weren't, they kind of said, well, that's not cool. You can't be talking about John and Johnny. Here we are right here, And so I guess I had less need for them as I grew older. As I grew, had more friends. And
there's a lot of pressure on children to grow up.
Yes.
Be a big boy.
Yeah. And, the difference now with my children, is that we seem to be out, well, especially in the Pacific Northwest, we were outside a lot. So we had an opportunity to just imagine all kinds of situations and types of playing out in the woods or whatever. So the woods were a big part of my growing up. And the woods could be both a great place of adventure, and it could also be a very dark and foreboding place at night, especially. So there was a fear factor there too, which is kind of neat that it serves both purposes.
Now, in the courses you teach, personal paranormal history, I imagine many of the students want to talk about experiences from their childhood.
Yeah, that's usually where they start. When we go around the room at first, when we do the introductions, I always give them a chance to do that the first class. They usually flow in chronological order. And, some don't, some skip around, and then I have to okay, that's enough time. Let's move on to the next person. And sometimes they get kind of blocked. I have a few people who will say something, but I'm not sure what that is. It's almost like they're afraid to say what it is. Especially I had one couple, very nice people, and they had a lot of conflict on what they could say. And I think some of it was kind of their religious upbringing. They were afraid to acknowledge these things, but yet they were brave enough to take the class. So they were trying to overcome that fear. So they'd say a couple of things, and then as the class progressed, they shared more and more as the class went on. So and now they've taken the class, I think they've taken it 3 times. Some of them have taken the class, I think 5 of them have taken the class 3 times.
And you've only offered it so far 3 times.
3 times, yeah.
So it's the sort of thing that the students want to keep coming back.
Yeah, so that means I change it up every time. I don't do the same thing every time. And even in my regular history classes, I try to incorporate current events into everything that we're doing and find historical roots to it. So, and then we bring in new guest speakers too, which is a big part of it. So that keeps it fresh. And for instance, one time I brought in a friend of mine who's a professional magician because I wanted them to talk to me about, black magic or what was called black magic or whatever, and what you do on stage. Is there ever a crossover? Are there professional stage magicians who do, other kinds of things, appeal to other forces or whatever. And it was a fascinating presentation. He did a little lecture. He brought some friends who were, that he was teaching as magicians. They did some magic. And he talked about it. And he said, sure enough, there are some professional magicians that are not just doing tricks. They also use some paranormal abilities as well, although they won't really acknowledge it. Yeah.
Well, other than imaginary playmates, what are the typical kinds of experiences that people reported to you from their childhood?
A lot of it is, I would say, stuff in their homes. Poltergeist activity, ghost activity, things like that. That's the most common. Some of them have more serious things, like some things that border on kind of demonic type stuff. So those are mostly what people are interested in talking about. Some of them, have had experiences of, precognition and stuff like that. And I don't think anybody's talked about telekinetic experiences, but so that's basically what they start off with. And then as the class proceeds and they see what the whole menu of things that can happen, they go, oh, okay, I think that's happened too. And then when you add in, I add in the UFO, alien abduction experience, all those things, because I have guest speakers with that too. Then some people will bring those experiences too.
Once they've heard a lecturer talk about an experience, it may remind them.
Then something is unlocked. It's like there's an unlocking of a story. I always think of, it's a story within a story within a story. It just there doesn't seem to be an end to it. And, which makes it so interesting. This class is just, I always think like teaching is the best way to learn. Even if you don't feel like completely prepared to teach this class, you are going to learn. And that's how I started in history. The first history class I taught was in graduate school. I was a doctoral student, and I had 85 students, and I got in front of them, and I had not been taught anything about the theory of education or teaching. It was just go teach them.
Yeah.
And you just have to figure it out. And out of, sink or swim, basically is what it is. And you realize you can only be who you are and share your experiences. So that's how my theory of history, this personal history came about. It's like, I'm going to share what I've experienced and tie it in to these historical events and what has happened to my family and the concept of war. When you're teaching American history, the concept of war is just, all over the place.
Yeah.
So I figured it out pretty quick. So I figured the same with the paranormal class. I came out with the book, then do the class, get these incredible guest speakers, and I'm learning from my students. I'm learning from them. I'm learning as we go through this experience together. So I'm looking forward to that doing that class for many years to come.
Now, you mentioned that some of your students report experiences that seem akin to a demonic encounter of some sort.
Yeah.
And I imagine even the use of a term like demonic suggests that they've been influenced by their religious education to think that way.
Yeah, and even my own experiences, I've had a couple of what could be classified as demonic. Now, as I've gone through a lot of this, I'm starting to question some of that. But, for instance, one very scary experience, I was in Germany, and I was a young soldier in Germany. And I was my girlfriend at the time, later became my wife. I was in her room waiting for her to come back off of her shift. And I decided, well, I'm going to go do something. So I went to for the soldiers, they have like an arts and crafts center. So I went in there and I was fashioning, using clay and making a model of a head. And then suddenly it came out, it's kind of this demonic looking thing. And the instructor came out. It's almost like I was doing it automatically or whatever. And the instructor came out and he looked at that and he said that, I think I've seen that before, that head before. I've seen that. And then he went back and he had this, I think it was like a book of demonology or whatever. And he came out and he identified what it was. I can't remember what he said it was. But
a particular demon.
Yeah. I said, that's what it is. So I brought it back to my girlfriend's room, and she had this little nightstand with a mirror. And I said, I'm going to scare her when she comes in. So I put this is all foolishness. One of the things I teach my students: don't fool around with stuff you don't understand, especially if it's something that could be very harmful to you. So anyway, I put this demonic head on her nightstand. I put some candles around it, and I was just sitting there waiting for her to come back off of her shift. And as I'm sitting there looking at it, sure enough, its mouth started to move. And it's clay. It's raw clay, but it's a solid form. Its mouth started to move, and it started mumbling, this kind of grumbly mumbling. And it was really frightening.
You were probably entering into a hypnagogic state.
Yeah. So I go, okay, this is a little bit more serious than I thought. And just at that point, she comes in. My girlfriend comes in. She looks at it and she said, where'd that come from? And I said, well, I was at the, I was just trying to fool around, maybe scare you or whatever. And I made it at the Arts and Crafts Center. And she said, I made a head like that when I was in high school. And I got rid of it. It looked exactly like that. I think we should get rid of it. I think this is horrible. And I said, well, you don't understand. The thing talked to me. And she goes, she screamed. And she grabs it and she opened the window. And it was like a third story in these old barracks in Germany, army barracks. And there was a dumpster down there and she threw it out into that dumpster. So that was the end of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know in your book you mentioned that you and your girlfriend at that phase of your life, you were dabbling in magic.
Yeah, she was
ceremonial magic.
It's interesting. When I wrote the book, of course, you have to get permission of people when you write these books and stories. So otherwise, you got to change the whole scenario and names. But I got her permission. But what's funny is that she doesn't remember that she was into that either. She says, "No, I wouldn't have done that." So I had to make it. It's all me. But yeah, it was her too. So, but yeah, it's just I didn't understand any of it. I just was dabbling around and what's interesting is we lived in a former Nazi barracks, so there was a bad vibe in that building anyway. I don't think it was SS. I think it was Luftwaffe because there's an airfield there in Mannheim. And so there's a weird feeling in that barracks anyway. So who knows what was, entering into this thing. And of course, with my ability to pick up stuff, what was happening.
You've had mediumistic abilities since your childhood.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Since age 4 that I remember. It first started with a kind of an angelic experience, kind of a healing experience.
Can you describe that?
Yeah. And it was in northern Norway and the island that I described. No hospitals anywhere. I came, we were living with my grandmother for 9 months and, I loved it because my grandmother spoiled me. But anyway, so I was out playing, and it was the winter time, so it was the dark time, as the Norwegians call it. It's dark for a couple months of the year. The sun doesn't come up. So I was outside, and I remember my neck getting stiff. I had a really high fever. My body was really achy. So I felt like I'm really getting sick. So I made it home, and I got into the kitchen, and my grandmother looked at me. She said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I'm sick. I couldn't move my head." She said, well, she had this little bed in the kitchen, in this old country kitchen. She had this little bed where she would take naps when she was making food, I guess, because it's too hard to go up and down the stairs. So she put me in that bed, and I remember I kept getting sicker and sicker, and then the relatives would come next door, and they, of course, they're all like the Grim Reaper, they're all saying, oh, this is what happened to Sven when he got polio. This is what happened, and this is what happened to talking to my mother. This is what happened to your first child. Didn't he get sick and he died the next day? So here I am listening to this. I'm 4 years old, but I understand what they're saying. And I'm just crying and I just kind of cry myself to sleep in this little bed. Well, I wake up and it must have been, I think they just let me sleep there and there wasn't anybody in the kitchen, but I woke up to this bright light in the ceiling. There's like these beams in these old farmhouses. And I looked up there and there was this bright light and it wasn't like a real human form, but I got the feeling that it was some type of an entity. It wasn't just a bright light and there shouldn't have been a bright light there anyway. And it was very warm. And the most incredible feeling was that I didn't worry. I wasn't worried about being sick. I didn't feel sick. I just felt fine. I just was like in total joy and happiness, and I went back to sleep and slept very soundly. When I woke up, I was completely fine. I wasn't sick at all. My neck wasn't sore. I was no fever. And my grandmother and my mother said, I told them what I saw, and they said, that was your guardian angel. That was an angel. And the angel healed you. And, thank God. And because there's no hospitals near there. A lot of people, they get sick. That's just it. They got to call for a doctor to come to the island and they have to take a ferry and, it takes a long time. Or you got to get in a boat and they take you to the...
It's a kind of situation where guardian angels are especially helpful.
Yes, in this case, very much so. So I survived that. So that was my first experience that I remember. Maybe there was things earlier.
Yeah.
But that's what I really have a real clear memory of. So I think what it did is kind of open the floodgates of possibilities. And that's when, I think the aperture opened, I guess you would call it. And, but it wasn't by choice. I wouldn't always say, okay, now I'm going to see angels or now I'm going to talk to dead people or whatever. It would just happen randomly, but frequently. My whole life.
Yeah.
So.
Now, a lot of people these days report when they do surveys of people's spontaneous paranormal experiences. What they find is that many of the people who report a lot of these experiences also report trauma and abuse in their childhood.
Yeah, and it's an interesting question. I write about in the second book. I stuck my neck out a little bit farther, and I do talk about that. I talk about an experience. The name of the story is My Nazi Aunt. So, and I did have an actual Nazi aunt. She wasn't a neo-Nazi. She was in the Gestapo in Oslo, the capital city of Norway, and she worked with Colonel Famer, who was the head Gestapo guy in Oslo. And her specialty was luring members of the underground into traps, and that's what she did. And she was responsible for probably 9 members of the resistance being caught and tortured and captured and killed ultimately. And so she made a very bad choice. On the other hand, my dad was in a labor camp, forced labor camp. That was my aunt was my dad's younger sister, and his older brother was a convoy commander. So he was a war hero. My dad was in a work camp, and here she is working for the other side. So after the war, she is given a death sentence for collaborating with the enemy for war crimes, actual war crimes. My uncle, my dad's oldest brother, used his reputation and all of his money to get a good lawyer. They got it commuted to life. And then later, after 9 years, he was able to get her out of prison for psychiatric reasons. I always said, my dad always said too, she was crazy like a fox. She got herself out of there. But she was a very unusual lady, and she was a very attractive lady, always well put together, the latest fashions and everything. She always looked much younger than she was. Anyway, fast forward to my Nazi aunt story. In Seattle, I was probably 15 years old. She was visiting, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and she was in my room. And she wasn't supposed to be in my room. I was downstairs. She was upstairs with her husband, my uncle, and my parents. And so I knew, I had a feeling that something had happened that wasn't appropriate. And the weird thing was that I have this memory that there were these like things around her. It wasn't just her. It was, I saw these little beings, and I couldn't say for sure what they are, but I remember seeing them around her. And, so that was probably an example of some type of, sexual abuse.
Of course, you were already 15.
I'm already 15. Yeah.
So you're a teenager by then.
Yeah.
I gather that for a lot of children, these sorts of events occur at a much earlier age.
Yeah. And I had another experience when I was probably, I'm going to say probably a few years before that. I wasn't a teenager. We were going into those woods that I told you about by our house. My whole life's growing up is defined by these woods, both adventure and great times and not so good times. So we had gone out into the woods, me and my little friends, and went a little too far. And a little too far, meaning that we weren't familiar with the area. Well, these older kids tracked us down, and there was always, that element out there. Yeah. And we were kind of in a junky area, and they captured us, and they were throwing rocks at us and torturing us. And I remember they were old enough, they were like drinking and smoking cigarettes and stuff. And I got hit in the head, and I think I was probably abused by one of those older kids. I never talked to my little buddies about it. We never talked about it, which is not unusual for people that have gone through trauma to not talk about it. Yeah. So I was probably, I don't know, maybe 8 years old or so at that point. And I've often thought about, and I've had somebody ask me that question, do you think that some of the paranormal stuff is because of, or do you think the paranormal stuff is because of your traumatization? And I said, no, it was happening before.
In your case.
Yeah, in this case. But I could see where it could affect it. And I think it probably did have somewhat of an impact on
my own hypothesis is that it works this way, that a young child can begin to experience abuse at the age of infancy, 2 years old or younger even.
Right.
It can happen that soon. And when it does happen like that, it probably happens more frequently than we realize. And sometimes maybe parents aren't even aware that this is what's going on because it's something they also endured as children.
Right.
But in any case, it causes a child to realize that the external, what we call the physical world, is not entirely safe.
Right.
So they retreat into an inner world, and they can open up doorways in their mind if they're persistently retreating inwardly. And when they open up those doorways, it can trigger visionary experiences, intuitions, and also legitimate experiences of what parapsychologists call psi.
I believe so. I believe the aperture was already open, so I was arbitrarily experiencing things, and that just accelerated, amplified it, and opened it some more. And I did retreat, somewhat, and actually, that's where a lot of my writing started. I started writing a lot. And I remember that, my parents knew that I was kind of in this inner world, so they got me a typewriter, this old manual Royal typewriter when I was probably 10 years old, maybe earlier than that. And I started typing. And I got to the point where I was pretty good at the typing. And, my dad, he could speak English, but he couldn't write English. So every once in a while, he was a carpenter and, he needed to work with some government agency or town or something. He said, I need this. Can you write this letter for me? So I'd type it for him. At age 10, I'm writing letters for my father.
In English.
I think, in English, yeah. He'd tell me in Norwegian, I'd write it in English.
So you knew both languages as a child.
Yeah, I grew up in both languages, yeah. And I think that probably helps too as well, because I know when I speak Norwegian, I feel like I'm a different person. Not a totally different person, but my vocabulary is different. The way I look at things is different. And, English has a much larger, selection of words. Norwegians tend to be more earthy and oriented towards the ocean, that kind of stuff, and very spiritual in a sense too. And so it's almost like you're a different person. I think you're using it. I don't know if it's actually a different part of the brain or whatever. I don't understand enough about it, but I feel that way when I'm speaking Norwegian. And I think that might help enhance a person's psychic ability as well. Having, being bilingual and bicultural and that type of thing.
So in your course on personal paranormal history, as your students are describing some of their childhood experiences, do they also get in touch with periods of abuse as children?
Some of them have mentioned it. Let's see. Not right away, like the people who have taken the class more than once. I think they feel more comfortable. It's kind of what I did with my books too. The first one I didn't mention. The second one I did. So I think they get comfortable at a certain point, and then they need to build on that to be brave enough to come forward. But not a whole lot of them. I suspect there are more stories out there. They just and I think that by me telling my story, that helps them to tell theirs. So I feel like what I'm doing, whatever these talents are, I just call them gifts. I don't call them talents because I don't want to make myself out to be anything special. I think everybody has abilities. Somebody asked me once, well, what is the difference between somebody who's had all these experiences that you've had and just an average person? And I said, well, I think everybody, I use a baseball analogy. Everybody can throw a ball, but some people can throw it 90 miles an hour. And then for whatever reason, that's just the way it is. A person can become better at it, and even people who are very adept can become even better. But I think there's a certain set of responsibilities that come with that, and that's I think that's a big part of this learning curve. Learning how you're supposed to be using these gifts. There's a real moral question there. Does that become a focus of your class? We do talk about that. We talk about, okay, if you have these abilities and you know that if you have the ability to maybe influence somebody, are you going to use that for something good, something helpful, or are you going to use it for your own manipulative gain, And I try to impress upon them that once you go down the road of, manipulation and stuff like that, it's a very slippery slope to the bottom. Kind of like when I talk to students about dehumanization, it starts with just calling somebody a dirty name. Next thing you know, you're treating them differently. Next thing you know, there's codification of that, put into law. Next thing you know, there's segregation. Next thing you know, there's extermination. So it's a very slippery slope. And I think we have to be very cautious when you have certain abilities. And working with people's emotions. When people come up to me and say, can you get in touch with my dead relative? I don't ever take any money for that. I just do it out of a courtesy. I feel like it's my responsibility to do it if I have time to do it, and I feel it's a moral obligation. I'm not against people who do take money for it if that's their living, or whatever. But for me, I teach, I have a full-time job, so I just do it to be friendly and nice to people. And I tell my students how I do it, the process I use and stuff. So I think there is, that is a big part of it. And also protecting yourself, which I stress a lot.
So in your class, there is a sense among some of these students that this is a gift that they can carry with them into the future and learn how to work with. Yes.
And it's a very important part of it that I give them, this idea that they can use this for good. They can use it for their own self, for their family, for their friends, and to make things better for them, but to be cautious about use of it as well. And so I think it's amazing how, even though they're different ages, different backgrounds, they have they already have that innate sense that this is a very important thing that we're all going through. And they all seem to have a feeling like and I have this feeling too, and a lot of people who are intuitives and so forth get this feeling that there's some kind of paradigm shift going on. And they catch on to that pretty quickly. Once we start putting everything together, they say, okay, now that makes sense, So, it's a fascinating class for so many different reasons. And I enjoy it. I enjoy teaching history still to, mainly younger students, but I also enjoy these older students. They're mostly older students, although we do have a few younger ones.
Well, Dr. Bruce Solheim, this has been a fascinating discussion. I think particularly useful for people in our viewing audience who either are children or who have children who are going through these experiences. Thank you so much for coming to Albuquerque and sharing this with me.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.